The wind swept gently across the rugged hillside, carrying the dry scent of dust and sagebrush. Sarah Whitmore stood at the edge of the rocky slope, staring at the strange inheritance that now belonged to her. The letter from the lawyer crinkled softly in her hand as the breeze tugged at the paper. She had read it several times already during the long journey here, yet the words still felt unreal. Her uncle Thomas Whitmore had left her his mining claim. That sounded far more impressive on paper than it did in person. In front of her was not a thriving mine or a valuable piece of property. Instead, it looked like a forgotten scar carved into the mountain. Large jagged rocks surrounded a dark opening in the cliff, half hidden by tangled weeds and scattered debris. The wooden supports around the entrance had turned gray with age, and several boards leaned at crooked angles as though one strong wind might send them crashing down. A rusted metal sign lay partly buried in the dirt nearby. Sarah stepped closer and brushed away some dust with her boot. The faded letters slowly came into view. Whitmore Mining Claim, established 1868. She folded the lawyer's letter carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. "So this is what you left me," she murmured quietly. The town clerk's words from earlier that morning echoed in her mind. He had looked at her with mild amusement when she asked for directions to the mine. "You mean that old hole in the rocks?" he had said with a chuckle. "That place hasn't produced anything in years. Your uncle worked it until it ran dry." At the time, Sarah had smiled politely, though the comment had stung more than she expected. She hadn't come here expecting great riches. But after traveling for 2 days by train and another half day by wagon through winding mountain roads, she had hoped the place might at least show signs of life. Instead, it looked completely abandoned. Still, the mine represented the only thing her uncle had left behind. Thomas Whitmore had always been something of a mystery in her life. When she was younger, he had been known as the adventurous one in the family, the man who packed up his belongings and chased opportunity out west while the rest of the family stayed behind. Letters from him had always been rare. When they did arrive, they spoke vaguely about hard work, long days underground, and the stubborn hope that every miner carried, the belief that the next strike might change everything. The last letter Sarah had received from him was nearly 5 years ago. Then, a month ago, news of his passing arrived instead. No explanation, no final message, just a lawyer informing her that she had inherited his claim. Sarah adjusted the strap of the small leather bag hanging from her shoulder and began walking toward the mine entrance. Loose gravel shifted beneath her boots as she climbed over scattered stones and broken boards. The air felt cooler near the opening. A faint damp smell drifted out from the darkness inside, carrying the earthy scent of stone and old wood. She paused just outside the entrance and looked inside. The tunnel stretched into darkness, its rough walls carved directly through the rock. Wooden beams stood at intervals along the ceiling, though several were cracked and splintered with age. Old tools lay scattered near the entrance, a rusted pickaxe, a broken shovel, and a metal bucket turned on its side. Everything looked untouched for years. Sarah pulled a small lantern from her bag and struck a match. The flame flickered briefly before catching the lantern wick. Warm golden light spread across the tunnel entrance, pushing back the shadows just enough for her to see a few yards inside. She hesitated. Part of her wondered if there was any point in going farther. But another part of her, the same stubborn curiosity that had driven her uncle west all those years ago, refused to turn back without at least seeing the mine for herself. Taking a slow breath, Sarah lifted the lantern and stepped inside the abandoned tunnel. Her footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls as the darkness swallowed the daylight behind her. Sarah moved slowly deeper into the tunnel, holding the lantern carefully in front of her. The warm light flickered against the rough stone walls, creating long shadows that stretched and shifted with every step she took. The deeper she went, the colder the air became, and the faint smell of damp earth filled the narrow passage. Her footsteps echoed softly through the mine, each sound bouncing off the stone as if the mountain itself were listening. The tunnel stretched farther than she expected. Wooden support beams appeared every few yards, though many of them looked worn and fragile. Some had splintered at the base, while others leaned slightly to one side as if they had been slowly surrendering to time. Sarah brushed her hand lightly along the wall as she walked, feeling the rough grooves left behind by mining tools. Her uncle and his workers must have spent countless hours digging here, cutting through solid rock in search of something valuable enough to justify the effort. Yet according to the town clerk, the mine had produced nothing. She paused when the tunnel split into 2 narrow passages. Both looked equally old and dusty. Sarah lifted the lantern toward the left passage first. It didn't go far before a pile of fallen rocks completely blocked the way. The ceiling above the collapse sagged dangerously, making it clear that attempting to dig through would be far too risky. She turned toward the other tunnel. This one continued deeper into the mountain. As she walked, she noticed old wooden carts resting along the walls, their iron wheels rusted and stiff. One cart had tipped over, spilling a small mound of gray stone onto the ground. Sarah crouched down and picked up a piece of the rock. It looked ordinary. No sparkle, no veins of gold or silver. Just dull stone. No wonder they gave up, she murmured quietly. She set the rock down and continued forward. After several more minutes of walking, the tunnel suddenly ended. Sarah stopped. The lantern light revealed a solid wall standing directly in her path. At first she assumed it was simply the natural end of the tunnel. Mines often stopped abruptly when miners hit useless stone. But something about the wall looked strange. She stepped closer. The surface wasn't smooth like the surrounding rock. Instead, large flat stones had been stacked carefully together, forming a barrier that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. Her eyebrows furrowed. This wasn't natural. Someone had built this wall. Sarah lifted the lantern higher and leaned closer, examining the edges of the stones. They had been fitted together tightly, as though whoever built the barrier wanted to make sure nothing could easily pass through. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Why seal a tunnel like this? She wondered aloud. Most abandoned mines were simply left to collapse naturally. There was rarely a reason to carefully close off a section unless something dangerous lay beyond it. Or something valuable. Her eyes moved slowly across the stone barrier. That was when she noticed the marks. Thin scratches and chips ran along several of the rocks. They looked like the fresh marks left behind by metal tools striking stone. Sarah reached out and touched one of them. The edges felt sharper than the rest of the weathered rock around it. These marks hadn't been made decades ago. They were newer, much newer. Her stomach tightened slightly. That meant someone had been here. Long after the mine had supposedly been abandoned. Someone had built this wall to hide whatever was behind it. Sarah stepped back, staring at the sealed tunnel with growing curiosity. For years people had believed this place was nothing more than a useless hole in the rocks. But now she wasn't so sure. Because whatever her uncle had hidden behind that wall, he had clearly wanted it to stay a secret. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she stepped closer to the sealed stone wall. The scratches along the edges still gleamed faintly in the lantern light, evidence that someone had worked here recently. She crouched down, brushing away small piles of dust and pebbles that had gathered at the base, and pressed her fingers against the cold stone. It was smooth in some places, rough in others, and strangely solid, as if nothing would ever pass through easily. Her mind raced. Who could have been here after her uncle abandoned the mine? And why? The town had always whispered that Thomas Whitmore was eccentric, obsessed with his work, but no one had ever suspected he might have hidden something truly extraordinary. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped back and examined the wall from a distance. It spanned the width of the tunnel, and the ceiling above it seemed unbroken, giving no clue of what lay behind. But her curiosity burned too brightly to ignore the mystery. She circled the wall, tapping lightly with the lantern handle on the stones. Each thud echoed back, solid and unyielding, except for one section near the center where the sound carried a slightly hollow note. Her heart quickened. She knelt down and ran her hand along the hollow area. There, a seam, nearly invisible, where the stones were fitted together more like a door than a wall. Her pulse raced as she traced the edges with trembling fingers. This was not a natural formation, it was a barrier built with intention. Sarah backed away and took a step back, taking in the full scope of the tunnel and the mysterious wall. She had always loved puzzles, loved the thrill of discovering secrets, but this felt bigger than anything she had imagined. A mixture of fear and excitement twisted inside her. Her uncle had left her a useless hole in the rocks, the townsfolk had said, but this wall suggested otherwise. Something significant, something worth hiding, waited just behind it. She studied the seam, looking for any sign of a latch, a hidden hinge, or a gap she could pry open. Her lantern cast flickering shadows that danced along the stones, making the wall seem almost alive. Finally, she noticed a small, almost imperceptible groove along the edge of one stone. She pressed her fingers into it and felt a subtle give beneath her touch. Her breath caught. Could this really be it? Summoning every ounce of courage, she gripped the stone firmly with both hands and gave a steady push. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan that echoed through the tunnel, the stone shifted slightly, revealing a dark gap. Her eyes widened. She had done it. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Gold, precious minerals, or something far stranger. She leaned forward, lantern in hand, shining into the newly revealed opening. The shadows danced across the walls beyond, and her pulse pounded in her ears. She took a tentative step inside. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint, unfamiliar scent, metal, wood, something deliberate. Whatever lay ahead had been hidden for a reason. Sarah's uncle had guarded this secret carefully, leaving no clue in the outside world. She felt a shiver of anticipation. This was no longer a useless hole in the rocks. This was the start of a discovery that could change everything. And as she stepped further into the hidden chamber, her mind whirled with the possibilities of what her uncle had truly left behind: treasures, inventions, secrets, or perhaps even a story that had waited decades to be uncovered. She had inherited more than a mine. She had inherited a mystery that would define her life forever.